We're so happy to be sitting here with Sherrill Milnes, the great baritone, who's going to speak with us a little bit about Fanciulla del West and his life. It's a great honor to be with you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I would like to start by asking you about the character of Jack Rance. You've sung many Puccini roles, and how is Jack Rance special?
Well, Jack Rance gets a bad rap because the baritone is so often the bad guy. He's actually the sheriff. He has some psychological issues. Maybe he and Mr. Freud would have gotten on very well, but you know, he loves the soprano. But of course, in almost all operas, certainly Puccini, it's the tenor and the soprano that are the love interest.
As a baritone, very often your character does not get the girl, which also happens to Jack Rance. Is that ever frustrating for you?
Well, I have often jokingly said the baritone doesn't get the girl on stage, but lots off stage. But that's a whole other discussion. That's a whole other discussion. It's true that the baritone, you could rattle off a dozen operas, is kind of the trois in the menage a trois. He loves the soprano loves the tenor, and they don't care about the baritone, and you know, he gets jealous. There's Rance. He's jealous. He loves Minnie. He's not very articulate. He's not a poet. The tenor is more of a poet, even though he's a thief. He's really the bad guy, but as we were saying, nobody thinks of him that way. And Rance is kind of torn. He has the sheriff's badge. He is the law in that area. How does he profess his love for this woman and arrest the guy that he knows she loves? It's problematic. He doesn't get it done, unfortunately. Some productions, fortunately not the Giancarlo Delmonico Net or Bonn, when Bonn was the capital of Germany. Fortunately not that production. Some have the Rance blow his brains out at the end. When they go off to California, Giancarlo Delmonico, the son of the famous tenor Mario Delmonico, had a hand thing between Barbara Daniels and me that there was something also. She felt something for Rance, much greater love for the tenor, but she felt something. And so when they're going off to California, she and he both reluctantly let go. He doesn't want to let go. She feels some kind of electricity. And the way Giancarlo did it, there's his six gun is on the ground. And they go off, and I reached down, picked up the gun in my hand. Curtain. What do you do? Your call. Your call. Oh yeah, I never did the other production that was in the Welsh National, I think. I was told about it, and blood. It was one of the German directors who liked blood and gore, peck and paw kind of thing. And apparently blood splattered all over everything, which was, this was much more human, I thought. And probably a little closer to reality. Rance did have a life to go on. He was still the sheriff.
So in a way they were trying to make him more like Scarpia, in other words. And there are a lot of similarities between Rance and Scarpia. Scarpia's the police chief.
All of this stuff.
Was there anything vocally that was similar about them?
The tessitura, the average range. Puccini, with only really one exception, Michele, we talked about that a little bit before. Il Tavaro. The other Puccini parts, not as high. The reason I don't really know why. Every time a baritone could sing a G or an A flat up there, he dropped the octave. Rance is a little bit of the Scarpia. I don't think he's as mean. He's frustrated. Scarpia gets frustrated too, but he's been frustrated before as a police chief. He is a cop. Scarpia is a cop. Rance is a cop, but in the West in the early, what are we talking, 1840s, so the gold rush time, really. It's not about cowboys and Indians and horses, although Minnie does sometimes come riding in on a horse. It's really the gold rush time, gambling and taverns and all of this, where money was pouring through the pockets, which is very different than Texas and herds of cattle. It's not that kind of West at all. Another factor, sometimes Puccini operas tend to be soprano tenor heavy. More arias written for the sopranos and the tenors in Puccini operas than for baritones. He dealt with character and character development very well. He made very interesting characters for the baritone, perhaps more so than Verdi and Mozart, although all of that's arguable. In any Puccini opera, without a great soprano and tenor, you don't have an opera. You're going to spend your biggest fees on the soprano and tenor. Over the generations, then less money has been spent for the baritones. So, often, certainly not always, but often, the baritone isn't as good a singer or an actor. And one thing that even a less good singer, they can kind of bark. They can parlando, if you know that word, and all that kind of stuff, and go away from the pitches and not make it as beautiful. So generations of less beautiful in some of these parts. I mean, the same is true of Enrico in Lucia. Certainly not Puccini, well before Donizetti, but without a soprano and a tenor in Lucia, especially soprano, when you don't have an opera. And the baritone was often, shall we say, undercast. So people don't think of Enrico, oh, he's the bad brother. Well, he's just trying to hang on to the family name, and some of it is selfish. But often the Enrico, like Rance, like some of the other parts, Lescaut, Sharpless, Marcello, or Chonard, there's two baritones in Bohème, undercast. So the singing is not as beautiful. And people, generations go by and people are used to, oh, well, it's kind of a barky part. It evolved. Doesn't have to be. And I think there's more beautiful music that shows itself to the public when it's sung well, of course, as acted well. Puccini, as we know, was a composer of the theater. I alluded to that earlier. All the parts, soprano, tenor, whenever there's a bass, there's not so many basses in his operas. They're more true to life.
Jack Rance's aria in the first act, was it, it's a very strange aria. I was wondering, was it hard to learn it, or did it pose certain difficulties to you?
Well, yeah, I mean, it wasn't difficult to memorize, per se. It was a bit difficult to make an arch out of it, because it does end a little abruptly. Tesoro. You want a little bit more. And in that aria, unlike kind of the operatic normal thing for arias like Visidarte and Tosca, the very famous aria, that's a time stop, that's a time freeze. Generally, arias are emotional. In Rance's aria, he's actually saying, well, the recitative before it, I was married. In fact, he's not divorced. They're just separated, and he never sees his wife, and he's kind of rationalized to her why it would be okay if they were together. You don't usually get facts of life, pieces of the chronology of a story in an aria. That's usually in conversation or early operas recitative. The arias are emotion. Well, he pours some emotion. He talks about gold and a little bit of greed, although he doesn't use the word greed. It is a rather unusual aria, but Puccini did that. Scarpia doesn't really have a lift aria. I mean, you can do the Te Deum, but the Te Deum without orchestra, you can leave the chorus out, but the Te Deum with piano in the end of the first act, doesn't cut it. You need the Puccini sonority to make that work. Oh yeah, bom, bom. Rance doesn't have that. You can lift that aria out. There's not a lot of baritone arias you can lift from Puccini. Michele, nulla silenzio. Marcello, no aria. Lescaut, no aria. Sharpless, no aria. and no baritone in the normal Verdi baritone sense in Turandot. There's the three Bobsy triplets, as I like to call them, and there's a baritone in there, but I never did those parts at secondary stuff.
Puccini very often wrote very realistic operas and calls for sort of a naturalistic type of acting. And I was wondering how you reconcile the naturalistic acting with the vocal technique that you have to do. So I was wondering how you make the choices you made when you learn a role.
A lot of it depends on your own approach to a part. Mine tended to be a little more voice first, and then find what I could do physically to make it work. There is no exact answer, depending on your own feeling towards something. There's usually a way to make the audience believe your emotion and have some kind of vocal salvation in mind, so that, not to get to the end of the performance, of course you have to do that, but how about 2 nights later, 3 nights later, 2, 3 years later, 2 or 3 decades later, that you could still do it. Acting in theater, acting in opera are related, but they're not the same at all. Your timings, and it's both easier and harder. They're both easier and harder. Timings in a play are yours. I could stare at you for seconds before I said no. Well, composer, if it's on 3, when 3 hits, you have to say no. He already put you in, if you want to call it a rhythmic straitjacket, he's dictated what you're doing. Well, that's both easier and harder. You have to superimpose the emotions within the rhythms of the composer. First, I want to sing it close, or as close as I can get, vocally, musically, emotionally, to what the composer intended. I have often said then to classes where I'm teaching or doing a lecture or something, if you can sing pretty much what the composer put on the page, you're 50, 60, 70% toward a character anyway. And that's one thing in singing, some of it happens while you're singing along. In theater, no. You need that motivation right away. And I have some operatic colleagues who want to sit down in a new production and talk about motivation from the outset. I'm not one of those. Let's get a mechanic that works. Let's do a staging. Then superimpose reasons why. Find reasons why to go with something. And if you don't, well, you ooch the staging a little bit. You sit down later, you sit down sooner, you pick up flowers, you take the sword, where you look, all that can be changed as you rehearse. I don't like to just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, and then you get on your feet, and your feet don't know where to go. Let's get some staging. That's what Goldovsky did. Staging first. And whether it was because of Boris, or it just made sense the way my mind worked as a Capricorn, they say that, although I'm not so much into that. We're organized. I like it organized. I get up here, I go there, I take the pillow, I hit you with the pillow, and I sit down. Okay, let's time it in the music. At the moment, I don't need a reason to do it. The reason is it's in the score. Then I can find emotional reasons, and it depends. That's where Puccini also was different than others. Tosca especially, fanciulla, some of it, but we were talking about Scarpia, bigger, more important part in a way than Rance. Your colleagues, how you do a part is often determined by what your colleagues do. Not so much the tenor in Tosca or the tenor in fanciulla, but what the soprano does. Tosca, for instance, is she a ladylike Tosca, feminine? Rance changes a bit with the mini.
Can you tell us a little bit about Boris Goldovsky, who you mentioned before, and what his opera company meant to you, what it was like?
Yes, Boris. Russian-born, Moscow, 1908. He was a pianistic wunderkind, just keyboard early on. Of course, I didn't know him then, but that's what one reads. His mother was a famous violinist at that time. He played piano for violin concerts. When the Bolshevik Revolution hit, they were in Western Europe. He never went back. All the time, and I met him in '59. He was afraid. A guy who would now go on with what else he did, of course. He was afraid if he went back to Russia, he wouldn't get out. However unreasonable that was, that's what he believed. He never went back. I think it hurt the fact that he didn't feel free to go back to his mother Russia, although he loved America. He was very pro-American. He established a touring opera company all around the United States, 50s and 60s, 70s, maybe into the early 80s. And then he became a bit too elderly just to do the mechanics of it. Conductor, pianist, as I said.
You grew up in the Midwest on a farm, and your autobiography is entitled American Aria from Farm Boy to Opera Star, and there's also a sequel, American Aria Encore. Is there any part of that life that has stayed with you as you've become an international opera star?
Well, I suppose work ethic. You know, down in dirty small family dairy farm, northern Illinois, 20 below zero, milking cows. Not fun. With that kind of a farm, especially dairy farm, the cows have to be milked twice a day. You have the flu, too bad, but you have to do it. You sprained your ankle or even broke it and it's in a cast. You go slower. That's your nod to pain. Go slower. You can't not do it. You didn't have the hired man to do twice the work. You didn't have any hired people. My brother and I and my father.
When you were young, you did a lot of different kinds of work. You did voiceovers. You sang for commercials and so forth. Did you enjoy that?
I did. I played stand-up bass, dance band stuff, you know, before rock. Because I'm the same age. I'm 2 days younger than Elvis. Same year. He was January 8, I was January 10. Same year.
Happy birthday.
And crooning, you know, businessman's bounce, the dance band stuff, again, before rock. So the jazz stuff and that kind of pop singing was easy and part of it. And I could sight read the tunes and whatnot. Marlboro, Schlitz, those were two big payers. The SAG, the AFTRA and Screen Actors Guild, I was a member of both, to be in the right union, and AGMA, of course. And there was a formula. There was a 13-week thing, and I remember getting a check, either Marlboro or Schlitz, I don't remember. And I bought choir robes for the First Congregational Church in Downers Grove. I figured that was good use for the money.
Do you remember what you sang for Marlboro?
Marlboro, you get my life to lie with a Marlboro filter flavor pack or box.
I remember.
Sure. Paid me a lot of money. I mean, that was a huge irony, singing for Gotovsky or singing in Miami, which we were talking about before, or 654 performances at the Met, all of that. You were paid for sweat time, I mean, hard working time. The commercial field, you'd put in an hour or 2 hours. I mean, 2 years later, checks would keep coming in for the workload you did those 2 years prior. That always seemed, I liked it, but always seemed unfair. Although I never screamed unfair.
You started a program in Florida called Voice Experience. Can you tell us a little about that?
It's an opera training program. One of the biggest problems for singers, whether you're talking recital singers, opera singers, oratorio, symphonic, biggest problem is you come out of music school, where do you go? What do you do? Now we have, which basically did not exist in my early time, now a lot of companies, most companies have an apprentice program, Met being huge, wonderful, prestigious one. Chicago Lyric has one. Houston is one of the top 3 or 4. San Francisco making it 4. But all the companies, Seattle and San Diego and all of them, they all have apprentice programs. The competition is fierce, and there's not the logical place to go postmasters. So our program, we try to help those younger singers, the 23 on up. One thing that's, a couple of things different about our program. We don't have a cutoff age. Most of the competitions and the apprentice programs, if you're over 32, you're kind of out of luck. Well, I understand the logic of it, but it's a shame. It's totally contributory, our Voice Experience Foundation. We have a website, Voice Experience Foundation, VOCEX. The 2 E's are pushed together.
If you could give one piece of advice to opera singers, young singers today, what would it be?
Well, some of it depending on their age, and I have said this phrase more than once: sing anywhere and everywhere you can. When you're young, you bring nothing to the table. You don't have any aces up your sleeve. And the world does not owe us. We have to prove. We have to deliver. Because we were wonderful in our hometown doesn't automatically cut it in a bigger hometown like New York. Yeah. New York is filled with major talent. So what divides some great singers? There are programs, Tucker Foundation, with which I'm very much involved, and they help a lot of singers. It's not just a winner, although there is one big winner, but they give a lot of scholarship money. And there are other organizations like that that help. Sing anywhere and everywhere you can. Get as much experience, whether it pays 0 or pays, it's always nicer to be paid big money. But I remember singing Messiah or the Elijah, the Bronze Requiem, or Haydn Creation, these great sacred works early on for nothing. And then I got $25. I thought, wow, $25. And then $100, which blew my mind. Or $500, or $1,000. $1,000 versus 0 2 years ago that I was happy to sing it because I love the piece. But loving the piece and $1,000 is better. Or if fees then continue to go up. Of course, it's nice to be paid, but I did lots of those non-paying ones, not because I was just doing it for the experience, although in hindsight, I suppose that was a good enough reason. I loved it. Beautiful music, and it's very satisfying to sing beautiful music.
Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it, and I'm sure everyone who's watching this appreciates it as well.
And my pleasure.